for a topic that's really top of mind for almost everyone in higher education. And as you listen to the webinar today, I hope that two themes emerge for you. First, while there might be quite a bit that feels uncertain to you on your campuses right now, I think there's actually a growing amount of certainty about the likely impacts that we're seeing from various federal directives and executive orders. So hopefully our content today helps to provide you with a little more certainty on that front. Secondly, I hope that you hear a need for institutions to focus on how they remain agile with your strategies, with your actions, in order to help be successful in the long run. So we will be covering a lot of information today, but again, I hope those two themes remain particularly prominent. I would like to mention to everybody that this session is being recorded and will be available on the NACUBO website. Also, you should see some Q&A functionality on your screen. We're not sure, just given our limited time today, if we'll be able to get to many or all of the questions, but we do encourage you to submit any questions that are top of mind for you. I'd like to start by quickly walking through our agenda for the webinar. After some brief introductions, we're going to walk through an overarching framework that we believe can provide you with some structure, with some focus as you think about how you navigate the current climate on your particular campuses. We're also going to sprinkle in a couple of poll questions that will pop up on your screen so that you can interact with us as the webinar continues. And these poll questions are going to help us gain a little bit of insight into trends across the institutions that all of our attendees today represent. Then we will pivot and use the majority of our time to really have a panel discussion about the various ways that campuses are responding to the federal directives and executive orders. But first, let's do some quick intros. I'm Lee Smith. I'm based in Louisville, Kentucky. Happy Kentucky Derby Week to all who enjoy that race every year. I have the honor to co-lead our strategy and operations team. I actually had a very long career in higher education, serving 3 different institutions across the country. Joined Huron in 2018, and I particularly focus on assisting universities to develop strategic responses to emerging challenges, especially in areas related to financial planning, administrative service delivery, human resources, and change management. I also work really closely with many academic medical centers across the country. Rick, I'll pass it to you now for your intro, and then we'll go to Brett, Nicole, and Dan.
Sounds good. Thank you, Lee, and welcome everybody. My name is Rick Rohrbach. I'm a managing director at Huron. I'm a CPA, and I've been working for about 30 years with research-intensive universities, hospitals, and academic medical centers. My work has focused on strategic planning. I'm also working to help improve the financial and operational performance of research institutions, and then really management of the research business more broadly. So I'm very excited to be with you today, and I look forward to our discussion. Brett.
Thank you, Rick. It's great to be with you all today and really appreciate you taking time to join us. We know that you're dealing with a lot, and we hope that this will be a helpful session as you navigate this certainty, as Lee has pointed out. I joined Huron as a principal about 2 years ago. Prior to that, like Lee, I spent many years on university campuses, 33 years at 2 R1 universities as VP for Finance and Operations, Chief Financial Officer. And I've really enjoyed working as a part of Lee's team in strategy and operations and helping universities strategize for the future, navigate challenges, take advantage of opportunities, and really to apply what I learned from 33 years on campus to now helping multiple schools. Thank you.
Thank you, Brett. I'm Nichol Luoma. I'm Executive Vice Chancellor and Chief Administrative Officer at WashU in St. Louis. Prior to that, I worked at Arizona State University for 12 years as Vice President of Business Services. And prior to that, I worked in corporate America and I was a consultant. Don't hold that against me. Happy to be here and I look forward to connecting with many of you after the webinar. Dan?
Thanks, Nicole. I'm Dan Layzell, and I'm the Vice President for Finance and Operations and Treasurer at the University of Alabama. I've worked in and around higher education for over 30 years. I've been a CFO at 4 different public universities, 2 R1s, and then 2 doctoral institutions, and looking forward to our discussion today.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you everybody for your introductions. We really have a great team today to walk through the content that I described earlier. Rick, I'll pass it off to you to begin walking through the framework we have.
Sounds good. Thanks, Lee. So we're going to kick off the webinar with a polling question. But before I get to the question, I'd like to ask everybody who's joined us to reflect on the following. First, are you working to anticipate policy changes, or is your institution reacting to what's been unfolding from the federal government? Certainly, much of what's happened so far has been unprecedented. I think everybody would agree with that. But there are enough tea leaves out there to at least begin speculating on changes to the research award process, to reimbursement policy, and also the regulatory environment. Second question might be, do you understand the potential financial impacts on your institution across different scenarios? So again, even if we don't know the specifics, has your institution thought about financial impacts in orders of magnitude? And then finally, what decisions are needed to address the likely financial challenges? More precisely, does your institution have a framework for making those decisions? And if I could, I'm going to add actually one more. What processes has your institution put in place to support communications among different stakeholder groups at your institution? One of the things when we were preparing for this that all of us have kind of noticed is that while institutions, in our view, have begun looking at the financial implications to the federal actions, there seems to be a little bit less emphasis on communications and change management than what we saw, for example, during the COVID crisis. So with that, if we could, let's go right to the question. And here's the polling question. Has your institution formed a task force to anticipate and develop strategies for addressing the potential impacts of federal directives and state actions? I'm going to give everybody a minute here to respond. Looks like we're getting there. Are we at about 80%? Wow, so it's about split. Interesting. If I'm looking at the results right now, so unsure. So a little bit more than a third of you have said yes. A little bit less than a third are saying no, and a little bit more than a third are not even sure if your institution's been doing that. So interesting results. Yeah, I think regardless, with this in mind, hopefully the concepts that Brett and I will be outlining in the subsequent slides will be helpful to institutions that have already started this process or can help frame how you approach this process at your institution. So if we go to the next slide, at the highest level, we're advocating for formal scenario planning. So while the nature of the funding reductions is important and certainly should be factoring into your decision making, in our view, more important right now anyway, is estimating the size of the potential financial gap and trying to understand how you might go about filling that gap. So this is just illustrative, but for example, you might consider the 3 scenarios that are shown on this slide. The first one suggests a 10% reduction in funding. In this scenario, the funding cuts might be due primarily to a reduction in indirect cost recovery, loss of funding for specific research awards or from different agencies, and or a decline in international student enrollment. A second scenario, maybe you're going to look at a 20% reduction in funding. And here you're going to see some of those exact same impacts, but now you're going to add to it the impact of a higher tax on your endowment and also maybe a reduction in state support. And then a third scenario kind of follows the same thing. We might actually say, hey, it's the 20%, but we're going to be more extreme in looking at how the impact of some of these funding cuts. As I said, this is just illustrative. The magnitude of the impact and the specifics for the scenarios that you guys might want to put together at your institution should really be focused on the current funding profile at your institution. The point we're trying to make here is it's important to put a stake in the ground and ask the question, if we lost X% of our funding, what steps do we need to take to actually go about closing that gap? So if we go to the next slide, to organize the effort, we propose a 4-step framework. I'm going to introduce the steps, and then I'm going to hand it over to Brett to walk through each of these in a little bit more detail. The first step here is estimating the impact on liquidity. So what are the near-term impacts, as best we understand it, to the changes on your cash flow? Number 2 is estimating the exposure risk to your institution's financial performance overall. So what do we mean by that? More specifically, how do the changes that we're anticipating impact specific programs or activities at your institution? Number 3 is evaluate response scenarios to generate insights. So here we're saying, what steps or actions can you take to increase revenue and or reduce cost? And then finally, how do you use those insights to make decisions? How should your actions be prioritized? And how should you manage communications and change management efforts related to the implementations of those actions? So that's kind of what we have in mind. What I'd like to do now is hand it over to Brett and allow him to walk through each one of these steps in a little bit more detail. Brett?
Yeah, thank you, Rick. So liquidity, Rick began our framework with a reference to liquidity. And what I would share with you is this was one of the first calls that we started getting from universities as the federal directives were being released. How will this impact my cash flow? How will this impact my ability to pay my bills? How will this impact my ability to meet payroll? So one of the first things that we've worked with schools and recommend doing is a more sophisticated cash flow projection across the weeks, the months, and the fiscal year coming, and to look carefully to determine, can you meet your liquidity needs? Even if we have strong balance sheets or strong net assets, if we can't meet payroll, not much of that will matter. So ensuring that we have liquidity in the cash to support the mission of our universities is critically important. So exploring lines of credit. Does your school have a line of credit or multiple lines of credit? Are those sufficient to meet your liquidity needs under the stress test that you would impose during these cash flow projections? Do you have a liquidity policy? I know I've said at times I might not need a liquidity policy to guide my thinking, but it could be incredibly helpful as we try to stress to our boards, our presidents, and other decision makers decisions that need to be made to ensure that we have the liquidity in place. What do our reserve funds look like? Another area that's important to focus on is your investment portfolio, working closely with your chief investment officer to calculate and to project cash flow needs and ensure that the investment portfolio and the managers are in a position to meet those as well. So again, this is really different than COVID. Rick referred to that in his opening remarks. During COVID, the federal government was the source of liquidity for many of our schools and universities. This case is totally different. So having to rely on existing resources, existing lines of credit, negotiating new lines of credit, this is a much different challenge than we faced during COVID. So Rick also talked about the importance of assessing the exposure risk to the institution's financial performance. This involves two things, both an assessment of the risk to programs, mission, activities of the university, but also for you all as financial professionals, what does this mean for our balance sheet? How do these impacts influence our financial performance, our operating margin, our net asset trends? What do our ratios look like a year out, 2 years out, 3 years out? Do I have a large debt issuance that's upcoming that this now presents challenges to my credit rating? So really doing some in-depth analysis of how this impacts your financial performance is really key. It's time to move from back of the envelope calculations. A lot of folks we've talked to, we hear that. It's like, well, we're talking about it. We're working on it. We've jotted some numbers down. This is not going to change anytime soon. So really engaging in that deep exposure to the risk, the financial performance, as well as the impact to your mission, portfolio and research, your student mix. How does that change through time as a result of this? And what implications might that have not only for your academic programs, but also your financial performance? A number of public schools are seeing proposed budgets for the coming year where not only are they facing reductions in federal funding, but also state appropriations. So carefully scenario planning this out for a multi-year period will be essential for you to provide guidance and assistance to your president, boards, and other leaders that you work with. Once we've evaluated the potential impacts, it's important that we develop tools and strategies to help, again, our presidents and other leaders. How can we help them navigate this so that the universities emerge strong? Is there an opportunity to emerge stronger? But the key is, what are the tools available to us, and how can we employ those to address these challenges that are being presented now with federal directives, perhaps state budget cuts and other things? We can really simplify this to say it's easy. We've got to grow more revenue, or we've got to better contain our costs. Now, of course, the complications are in the details, but I'm going to quickly share some that we are seeing from many of our clients and that many of you are reading in the news. I think the key here is that there aren't any magic formulas. There aren't any silver bullets. We have a really important core business for research, service, education, and we don't have an enormous number of tools. So let me run through what we're seeing from a lot of clients. Many schools have decided to enhance their fundraising. This is not something that was common during COVID. During COVID, nobody was kicking off a new capital campaign. We are seeing schools use this opportunity and this challenge, though, to enhance fundraising efforts, to improve the performance of the fundraising operations. We're also working with schools to monetize assets. Schools are selling real estate, leasing facilities that once were used for internal business. And another exciting thing that we've seen, and we've worked with schools, is helping them to optimize restricted fund balance through an AI application that scrubs donor restricted agreements and matches those with funds available, and allows universities to shift funding from either state funding or from areas that have been cut off to those restricted fund balances. And then more interest in reducing spend on things like travel supplies. Schools are getting really serious about strategic sourcing, also renegotiating leases, capital plans, and controlling labor costs. So while all of those are options and great ideas, they ultimately need to translate into decisions. They ultimately need to translate into plans so that we can deliver results for our institutions. What we have here, again, is an illustrative example, much like the framework that, or I'm sorry, the scenarios that Rick shared. And we believe that it's helpful to think about these options in terms of a return on investment versus effort required matrix. For those that are more comfortable with a more pure financial principles, it's a risk versus return strategy. What are those things that we can do that can generate significant returns, but that can be done more easily? And then what are those things that offer an opportunity for very significant returns, but might be longer term? So we're seeing many schools adopt more quickly strategic sourcing, whereas in the past this had not been the case. Those are less complicated, less disruptive to campus, but also generate significant returns. When you look at things like enrollment and pricing strategy, we're seeing a lot of large publics and privates actually move to increase enrollment. They have the capacity, and they look at this as a strategy that could potentially offset their loss of international students or loss of research funding in some other areas. But those strategies take a little bit longer. Same thing with optimizing service delivery model. Some schools are looking at more shared services as a way to manage labor cost, but those are also more challenging and longer term. So think about this return, risk and reward matrix as you think about your strategies and make recommendations. Again, these aren't the same for every school, but the key is to translate these ideas and options into actions and solutions for your campus.
Brett, I might add, and I do want to make sure we have enough time for the panel discussion, but I think it's important. So this framework is a good way of thinking about the risk versus reward, but it's also a good way to think about how to prioritize. And so if you're thinking that you've got three different scenarios, as I presented, 10%, 20%, and 30% reductions in funding, it may well be that if you get to the extreme level, you're going to have to do all of these. And so one of the ways to think about this isn't just risk versus reward, but which should we do first? And I think that's really one of the important steps here. When you think about, am I ready to take action if some of the uncertainties become more certain, you should really have a roadmap that says, okay, it turns out that it's around the 10% scenario. So I know which actions we're going to take, and I know what order we're going to do those actions in. And then if you actually, if it was a 20%, maybe that basket becomes a little bit bigger, but you still have a plan. And that's really what we're advocating for here. It's one thing to understand the magnitude of the issue and have some sense of what to do, but it's another thing entirely to say, if something happens, I already know which plan I'm going to dust off and start to execute against.
Thank you, Rick. That's incredibly helpful. We'll move now to an additional polling question. We're really interested and think it'll be instructive for you all to share with your peers on this call. Also, what tangible actions has your institution taken in response to the federal directives as well as state actions? No action yet, still in discussion, early steps. Let us hear from you and we'll go over the results. So these are, again, similar to the first results, really interesting. We're seeing a small sample that have no action yet. About a quarter still in discussion. 36% early steps underway, so still in the evaluation and decision-making portion. And then 18% actively implementing changes and 14% unsure. So an interesting distribution across the entire sample set. And we hope that you come away from this today with more of you moving into the actively implementing changes answer, that you will develop scenarios and, as Rick said, have plans in place for all of the potential situations and to begin implementation. So thank you. And Lee, I'll turn it back to you for the exciting part with our panelists.
Yeah, thank you, Brett. Thank you, Rick. So we are going to pivot now to a discussion with Nichol and Dan. And I told Rick and Brett I might still call upon them as well. Let me start by saying what I have not asked Nichol and Dan to do, and that's two things. One, I haven't asked them to opine on any of the federal directives or executive orders. And two, I haven't asked them to reveal in great detail what is actually taking place on their own campuses. Both Nichol and Dan have terrific networks across the country. They've been heavily engaged with their colleagues throughout the first several months of this year. And our goal is really to draw on their perspectives as respected leaders across the country. So with that in mind, Nichol, let me start with you, and I'll ask you, how are you seeing higher education leaders collaborating, both inside of institutions, but at times across institutions that are peers, for example? And how is this collaboration focusing on effective responses to these federal directives and executive orders?
No, thank you. Thank you very much. There's been a number of things that we've been doing, and I am on the board of NACUBO, which is part of NACUBO. And what I love about higher ed is collaboration. In higher ed, we are somewhat competitive. We're competing for students, but generally we do have an altruistic goal of advancing society. And NACUBO and higher ed consultants like Huron are really helping us facilitate knowledge, best practice sharing, and even coordinating advocacy, which is really, really important right now. Other networks like the AAU has shown up to rally universities around a common purpose and leverage their scale. And then there's our informal networks where we're all talking, we're sharing the communications that are going out. Higher ed is pretty transparent about what's happening once there's a communication. It's not like corporate America, so you can see what others are doing pretty easily. Collaboration within the institution is absolutely just as important, if not more important. I'm pretty new to WashU. I started in February of 2024, and just getting to know a private university with a medical school versus a big public university was very interesting. One of the things I did as chief administrative officer was to start a committee, and this was before January, called the Executive Resource Committee. This is a subset of our cabinet, and it includes all of us who have control of most of the resources on campus. It includes me as the CAO, our CFO, the Executive Vice Chancellor of Advancement, the Provost, and the Chief Business Officer of the medical school. We started this group, like I said, early last fall, and we've already gone through that weird dynamic of forming, storming, and norming. We've gotten to know each other. We've talked about, higher ed had risks going into January, and we've already talked about some of those. So I feel like that helped us position ourselves to move into January, which was a surprise for many of us in terms of what was coming. We've had discussions around priority and cost, and I feel like this has well positioned us to quickly understand the issues that are upcoming and make robust decisions moving forward. And I know we're going to get into more detail, but part of that is really deciding, what are we? What do we want to be? And what are the things that are happening in this world? And what can we do to mitigate? Or what do we need to do to change internally? Higher ed is very ingrained in what it does, and culturally is really, really hard to move. But during a crisis or a perceived crisis, I do believe that it's helpful to leverage that and to make some changes that are needed. So it's a very anxiety driven time, but we could also look at this as an exciting time for us as finance or operations professionals to do things that we've always wanted to do.
Yeah, Nicole, thank you very much. Really, really interesting details there. Dan, let me go to you with a similar question. How are you seeing higher education leaders collaborate both inside institutions, but also across peers?
Sure, and thank you, Lee. I think I'll start internally, what I'm seeing, not just here, but certainly elsewhere, is that given the current situation, and I would agree that this is much different than what we faced when we were in COVID, and we need to be thinking longer term solution is just taking a look at where are there opportunities for us to um, engage in more of a shared services model. And by that, I'm saying, for example, looking at opportunities to, do, and again, this is across the board, but looking for opportunities to, have a more centralized model of some functions. I'll use strategic communications and marketing as one area where that tends to be fairly decentralized on many public university campuses, and developing more of a shared services model at the institutional level that is able to leverage efficiencies centrally while also certainly maintaining flexibility and responsiveness at the college and the departmental level. And so, having those kinds of conversations has been, certainly, I think you're seeing a lot of institutions engage in that. Certainly, other administrative functions are also having similar sorts of focal points. One thing I would add on to what Nicole mentioned was, this is a practice I've used, as a CFO at other institutions, is just having regular touch points with faculty, Senate leadership, and other key academic leaders. Again, what I found is when you have regular conversations with your colleagues, faculty, and colleagues and others in the academic area, in the good times, it makes it easier to have tougher conversations when you get to the more, I guess, the tougher times that we're finding ourselves in now. Creating that level of trust, creating that transparency, I find is really has been very helpful in terms of just entering into these kinds of conversations.
Thank you, Dan. And um, your comments really touch on an important topic, which is around the change management, the communication that needs to be in place to really support effective collaboration and advancement of ideas. I particularly liked your comments around the building of trust with faculty senate leadership in particular. Let me ask you, what are some of the other communication methods that you're seeing be particularly effective? I think that in addition to meetings, there are, of course, other ways that campuses communicate, particularly with issues that are top of mind, like what we're discussing today, and especially with other populations too. So the faculty senate is one critically important group of stakeholders, but so is the remainder of the faculty, your staff, your students, your alumni as well. What are some of the strategies that you're seeing being deployed for those groups as well?
Sure. Well, I think first and foremost, it's important as senior leaders that we again, be very visible on campus, right? And that we continue to participate in campus life. I think there obviously there are any number of ways to get the message out. I think it's sometimes we are feel less likely to want to, if we don't have all of the information, to send out communications. And again, this is a very, very fluid and dynamic situation, but I think, what I'm seeing is that at least that tentativeness is starting to melt away, because I think people, when people have a vacuum on campus, feel that there's a vacuum of information, they tend to create their own, which is often not helpful. So I think, being timely with sharing what we do know when we do know it, and committing to, via, social media, via, email, the old-fashioned email, right? Via other electronic means, even if you don't have all of the information, I think what I'm finding, or what I'm seeing, and not just here, at Alabama, is that people really do appreciate hearing from their senior leaders, and having that regular engagement. I think that's probably the most important strategy that you can take in times like this, be more frequent, even if it's, you don't have all of the information at hand that people may want. Just be committed to be transparent.
Yeah, Dan, the accessibility of senior leadership is always important in situations like these, but your emphasis on timeliness, on transparency, also really important. Nichol, I'm curious what you're seeing from your seat as well. What are some of the effective strategies in your mind for communicating with not only faculty, but also staff, students, and alumni as well?
Yeah, I think it's multifaceted. I think you have to look at the various audiences. We have students that are asking, and tailor your message to them sometimes, and to what they'll actually read. I think higher ed went through a weird thing where, since we're usually so decentralized, everyone's sending emails all the time, we got very controlled, and, oh, you only send an email if, or whatever. And we are hesitant to send too much communication, and sometimes hesitant to send something when we don't know what's really happening and we can't give very clear direction. I think what we know about people and the unknown, COVID's a great example. There was a lot of fear and anxiety about what was coming. People do need regular communication, even if it's to say that you don't know. So we've done, some very targeted emails to our constituents. I actually run the university management team here at WashU, and we did a coffee side chat with the chancellor, where we had some questions that we knew were FAQs out there that people were nervous about, that I asked him, and then we took some live questions, which can be difficult, but also we want to be coming across as authentic. We don't know in many cases what exactly is going to happen. And that is very, very difficult for those of you in leadership that are on this Zoom. We know this is very difficult, and people are extremely stressed out, but the people that are relying on us that don't know exactly what's going to happen are, when people don't hear, they'll make things up, and rumors will start. And so we have found that our core principles around communicating are, multi-layered. We tell the truth. If we don't know, we say we don't know. And then when we do know something, we do communicate it, even if it's a hard message.
Yeah, thank you, Nichol. Really, really helpful perspectives there. I'd like to pivot our conversation now to talk about boards for a few minutes. And whether on your campus you call this group a board of trustees, a board of governors, or some other name, these entities, of course, have really important fiduciary responsibilities for institutions. And we, of course, are all well aware of some of the impacts that, some of the substantial impacts that many institutions are forecasting. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what you all are seeing from boards. And of course, the board configuration for campuses varies. Dan, for you, it's a system level board. For others, it's boards that are aligned with single campuses. But Nichol, let me start with you. I'm curious, how are you seeing board members either in the formal meetings themselves or in some of the regular conversations they have with senior leaders on campuses? What are some of the questions that board members are asking? How are they engaging? What are they telegraphing to leaders that they expect them to do during these times? So, Nichol, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think that when you think about the role of the board, and I know it varies greatly, from state institutions to now me being in a private, this is to me the very space where boards should be involved and asking questions. There are material risks to higher ed, right? And many institutions are facing a risk even to their mission. And so they're asking good questions. They're also assisting with advocacy in many ways. Our board is, many, many talented individuals with, exceptional business backgrounds that are very well connected, right? And so I think that they're looking, how can they help? They're being extremely supportive. They understand this isn't a matter of us doing something wrong. This is a matter of some unexpected market risk that has emerged, but they're also holding us accountable, which I think they should be. So things like you mentioned in your early slides about scenario planning, they expect us to be doing robust scenario planning, not only for all the things related to the federal directives, but also related to, maybe an upcoming recession. What are we thinking? What are our business models on campus? We're getting into a lot of details around, and for business people outside of higher ed, it is very hard to understand the decentralized, non-mandatory nature of how we operate as universities. And so again, as an interesting, time in higher ed, I think there is more of an appetite to look at some of these core business models that are, known and practiced in other industries. And I think they're expecting us to do that, and they're being supportive. I see that they're not being anything but supportive. The other thing that they are expecting from us, at least here, is that we're being strategic, right? So we're not saying, hey, X% of our budget is at risk, and so we'll do a peanut butter thing, and we'll just say everybody shares the pain, because usually in business that means that could be a path to not doing well. And that's not to say that that's not important to do in some spaces. We have a variety of measures that I'll mention later, but that's not the only thing. So they want us to actually be very deliberate, take more of a surgical approach to the situation. Where do we have opportunity? Dan mentioned shared services. That is something that's being looked at. And the interesting thing is, in this crisis, and you never waste a good crisis, departments and some of the folks that weren't on board before to do some of this because they were happy to do their own thing, when they're seeing the pressure that they might have on budget, they're willing to play, and they're willing to engage and try to think about the entire whole of WashU versus just their unit. And so even though we are super decentralized, we are very much an RCM budget model, we're seeing people come together in a way that makes sense. And our board is somewhat expecting that, but also being very supportive of us in the background.
Yeah, thank you, Nichol. And I think some of the details you shared there about board members, of course, bringing their varied perspectives, both from the private sector and the public sector, and really engaging in a deep and meaningful way. Certainly, we're seeing those trends as well. Dan, let me throw the same question your way. What are you seeing and hearing from boards of trustees?
Well, I think, at a sector level, the responses, at least I'm hearing from my colleagues, is it really varies by where you're starting financially, right? If you're already starting from a financial place of weakness, I think the response is probably a little more urgent than you might be seeing elsewhere. But the one differentiator, and I was thinking about this the other day, many of us lived through the Great Recession, right, back in the 2000s, and I think the responses then were very short-term focused. And I think what I'm seeing from, again, to Nicole's point, across the board cuts and, travel freezes and all of that, I think what we're seeing now is a focus, and asking strategic and operational questions of senior leaders. I think, I'm seeing, it's interesting. This has in some ways refocused boards on what research is, right? How is research funded? What is our research portfolio? How do indirect cost revenues get allocated? I mean, all of these very fundamental questions at an institutional level. I think it's an opportunity for us, as senior leaders to engage in some strategic conversations with our board members about, where are we and where do we want to go in terms of our research enterprise. For some of us, it's a substantial research enterprise. So, I think, what I'm seeing now is along the lines of what Nichol is saying, which is, certainly the boards want to be advocates, where they can be, with their contacts, but I think they are very much, perhaps as opposed to prior sorts of financial crises, wanting to be more strategic in their conversations.
Thank you, Dan. And Rick, I'm going to give you a quick question as well to follow up on Dan's comments. So I think there are probably an increasing number of opportunities where boards are looking for some additional information or education about things like the research portfolio on a particular campus. If senior leaders are thinking about how they describe and explain their research enterprise and mission to their boards, how would you recommend that they think about doing that?
Well, I'll piggyback on what Dan and actually to a certain extent Nichol were talking about. This really is an opportunity to focus on education, right? I mean, it is putting a spotlight on parts of the business that I think boards and really other stakeholders have been aware of, but they don't really understand how they work. And so I think one of the first things to do is to step back and understand, as Dan was suggesting, what are the financial mechanics of the research enterprise to begin with? So actually, let me step back and say the first thing, depending on the nature of your institution, is why are we in the business of research to begin with? Get everybody level set on that. Why is this an important mission? What is it we're trying to accomplish? And how do we measure success? Because, especially since I spend most of my time in this space, when we get involved with performance improvement projects, people are always looking for an ROI for the research business. And if you're looking for a financial ROI, if you're in academic research, that's pretty difficult to come by. And so you can't really look at it that way. So there are certain board members who are not engaged in academia in the way that most of us on this call likely are. And so helping them understand the value that it brings to the academic mission, the synergies that it has if you're at an academic medical center with the clinical mission are really important. And then just talking about the fundamentals of research finance. Really, where does the money come from? What are the different types of sponsors? When we talk about indirect costs, why are the rates so different from the federal government versus other types of sponsors? You don't necessarily have to get into what's the difference between total direct cost and modified total direct cost, but I think giving them the basics helps them have better appreciation for it. One thing I'll also throw out, Lee, is Huron did a study with a AAMC about 6 years ago, and we asked the question, for every dollar of extramural funding, regardless of sponsor, that you're getting for your institution to support research, how many additional dollars do you need to have to support the research mission? And what we found was that on average at medical schools, the answer was 53 cents on the dollar. The reason I bring it up is I think there's a sense that, at least among some, that research might make money, or that, for example, you've got the federal government suggesting, at least implicitly, that taxpayers are being gouged. The opposite is true. Basically, institutions, just by the nature of engaging in research, are already making a substantial investment in supporting that that mission. So I think helping people understand that is important, and then understanding really what pieces are kind of uncovered. So it's a matter of managing the portfolio and not just, looking at opportunities to cut cost.
Yeah, thank you, Rick. And I think just in the context of the mission delivery, and of course, everyone on the call has some combination of education, research, and/or clinical missions. But Dan, let me ask you, what are some of the both the short-term and the long-term actions that you're seeing institutions already undertake? We saw in our polling question earlier that even the attendees on this webinar are at various places on their journey to making decisions and implementing certain actions. But maybe just talk high level, what are a few of both the short and long-term actions that you're seeing are fairly common right now?
Well, I think what I'm seeing is, I probably longer term, for the most part, longer term solutions, but I think ones that are going to have more staying power. I think, you're certainly seeing, and certainly on my own campus, we're, looking at just basic fundamental business processes and, are we doing things in the way in which we should be doing them? And, I will say we're at the very early stages of a new ERP implementation, and that in and of itself is going to force us to ask those questions. And we know that there are going to be, when we come out at the other end, we're certainly going to be in a much better place there. I think, one of the other things that, again, I'll go back to what we talked about earlier, looking at opportunities for shared services. And, you mentioned that, we're Alabama is part of a system, and I've been part of public university systems elsewhere, and there's always opportunities to look at, functions that can be done centrally at a much more efficient manner than, being decentralized. There are certainly ones that can't, but I think certainly there are operational functions. I mentioned communications. I talked about, certainly human resources, certainly the financial management piece. There are opportunities to realize some efficiencies there, more centrally, either at a system level or at a single institution level. So, I mean, again, these are not what I would call short-term fixes, because they involve some pretty hard conversations with people. And anytime you're talking about, organizational turf, it certainly tends to get people to be defensive in terms of not wanting to give things up, quote unquote. But I think that, again, that what I'm seeing is that, when you're faced with this imperative, and as Nichol said, never waste a good crisis, I think it gives you some cover to say, hey, listen, I think, this is not, this is not something that's going to go away in 6 months, a year, or even 3 years. We're going to have to, this is a new operating reality for us, and we're going to need to think about how we can position our institution to be, to be sustainable financially and otherwise.
Yeah, really, really helpful list to hear, Dan. Nichol, anything you would add to that list, both on the short and long-term ends?
Yeah, I think the focus is on long terms and not making short-term decisions that are in conflict with our strategy or mission. Short-term wise, I think we're seeing cutting back on discretionary expenses. You all mentioned that in your slides. Requiring certain backfills or new hires to have a higher level of approval. I think it's more of a measure of preserving cash right now. And so really operate, because we're in a state of unknown and we've done all these scenarios, preserving cash as much as possible. Are there certain capital projects that we can suspend? Are there certain maintenance projects that we can hold off on till we know what's happening? And then if something happens tomorrow and we need to pull levers, what levers are easily accessible to us from, again, a cash perspective? You all hit on that on your slides. But then long term, really looking through, I think Dan really hit it on the head. a lot of this isn't going away. So how do we use this right now as a way to think about how the university will be 10 years from now? So that takes looking at strategy, who do we want to be, where are we making investments, maybe relooking at your strategic plan, but also where are we not making investments? And that's a hard thing to do in an RCM model and a decentralized model. And so it's really focusing on where do we want to be good, where can we look at maybe not investing anymore, and who do we want to be long term. And I think that this is the time where higher ed really needs to do that.
Yeah,
What,
please go ahead, Dan.
No, Lee, one thing I want to add to that, and it's more, I would say at a microeconomic level, but it touches on something that Brett mentioned early on, which is, as a strategy, be it short or long term, it's, looking for opportunities to maximize how we leverage our restricted funds. And, at a prior institution, we found after an audit that there were several $1 million in restricted scholarships, donor restricted scholarships that were not being granted each year because the restrictions were so tight that you just could not find, you couldn't find a trumpet player from a certain county and name the state. So I think, going through a disciplined exercise like that, and again, the institution was able to free up several $1 million that was much more unrestricted to be allocated for scholarships. And, that's just one example, but I think, it's kind of maybe changing your perspective and trying to think more broadly about those sorts of things.
Yeah, and we've certainly seen a number of institutions looking at their restricted funds, particularly quasi-endowments, and finding quite a bit of opportunity there to redeploy some of those terms. We only have 2 minutes left, and I have one additional question, so I want to try to get a quick response from both of you to this. If we think about this in a long-term perspective, and Nichol, I loved some of your comments about aligning that with strategy, with mission. In a lot of ways, we have, as higher ed leaders, an opportunity now to drive innovation and entrepreneurial thinking in a way that maybe we've not had for quite a while. What are some of the discussions you've heard around the topic of innovation and what could emerge there? So, Nichol, let me start with you quickly, and then we'll go to Dan next.
I think it's leveraging AI, especially in the space of where you have shared services and you have control of a center function. That is where you're going to get the most bang for your buck. I love your comments around AI, around looking at restricted funds. That's phenomenal. AI is a biggie, and I don't know that we're leveraging it in operations like we should. Again, looking at our board of trustees, we have some CEOs of companies that have talked about how much cost they're taking out of their system. So that's great. The other area that I would really focus on is space management. Because when you look at the cost of running a university, it's people and it's physical plant and supplies, right? And so looking at how are we executing space management, we're doing a master plan. First thing that we're doing is a space inventory. And we think, given where we are right now, that this is the right time to really start leveraging what's happening to make that part of our culture at WashU.
Terrific points, Nichol. Dan, what are you seeing?
Well, I'll start with where Nichol ended, which is talking about space, and frankly, one of the benefits of where we find ourselves research-wise is being able to engage with colleagues on campus and explain that space is not free, right? The space that is allocated for research costs, as Nichol said, and thinking more strategically about how we deploy space because we need to be as optimal as possible. I think one of the other areas where I think certainly in the public sector campuses are looking at more broadly what opportunities are there for outsourcing, right? And thinking strategically about what is it that is mission centric that you don't want to, you should not outsource, and what are those activities which, may have certainly been a good thing, good thing to have, internally within your university as a function. Maybe, maybe you don't need to do that. But again, I think that's that is a conversation that, you need to look certainly at what your mission is, think strategically about where you want the university to be, and think, is moving in that direction, outsourcing various functions. Is that something that, that we need to seriously consider?
Thank you, Dan. We'll let that be the last word. And let me just thank Rick, Brett, Nichol, and Dan, but especially Nichol and Dan as really respected higher education leaders for taking the time to sit down with us today and share their perspectives. We're certainly interested in continuing the conversation with anyone who has questions or other follow-up needs. Our contact information is on the screen here. There's also a QR code in the upper left that you can pull out your mobile phone and snapshot to contact us as well. We know this really important conversation will continue, and we thank everybody for joining us today. Have a great rest of the day, everybody. Goodbye.